Veronica O. Davis is a self-described transportation nerd and author of Inclusive Transportation, a manifesto for repairing divided communities. She believes everyone should have access to safe, reliable, and affordable transportation.
She is currently the director of Cities Program for Atkins Realis and has over 20 years of experience in civil engineering and planning. Under the Mayor Turner administration, she was the director of transportation and drainage operations for the city of Houston.
She also served as the vice president and City of Houston representative on NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials.
Veronica earned her dual master's degrees in engineering management and regional planning from Cornell University, and she has a bachelor's of science in civil engineering from the University of Maryland.
All right, Veronica, welcome to Curb Enthusiasm and to New York, which you took a multimodal trip to get here.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
So your expertise is both in engineering and urban planning. And with a foot in both worlds, like what do you think planners and engineers can do to better communicate with each other and also better communicate what they do and the value of what they do with communities that they're working in?
You know, I'll say this. Most recently, I was at the City of Houston, the Director of Transportation and Drainage Operations, and having an operations and management function, I feel like all planners and engineers need to do that at some point. Because I will say, if you'd asked me 4 years ago this question, I would say, yeah, engineers and planners need to work better together. They need to work on the process together, because what tends to happen is there'll be a planning project, the planners lead it, come up with the design, and then the engineering teams take over and they're like, this doesn't work for this, and this reason. And I think particularly with planners, we're just looking building face to building face at the surface of a road, whereas engineers have to think in 3D. And so we say, oh, just move the curb line. And then the engineers are like, time out, moving the curb line puts it on top of the water line. If we move the water line, now we have to move the gas line. And so there's just a different level of understanding of the complications beneath our feet. But having an operations and management function, I would have planned and designed a lot of projects differently. I think that oftentimes we do a plan and then operations and maintenance is like the last paragraph of the last page that no one ever really reads. And I think it needs to be emphasized more because I definitely would have designed bike lanes differently. I would have designed a lot of roadways differently, knowing that at some point this has to be maintained by somebody.
Absolutely. Yeah. At DOT, with all of our infrastructure, but also our public spaces, like it's not just about having an amazing design, but it's about having a plan to really maintain and care for it over the long term. And that's also a huge part of the equity factor, is making sure that all of our streets are maintained for everybody in the city.
Yeah, I'm also curious from your perspective, how the profession actually needs to change to really sort of reflect sort of this line of thinking, I guess on both ends.
I think both on the planning and the engineering side, we don't really train people to deal with communities. Even planners, they might do community engagement for a class, like for their community, they'll have a studio class and they might work with a small constituency. But I think it's different to actually have to plan and structure a meeting that informs what you're trying to do. And you can kind of learn it at the job, but I think that is a challenge that we have for both planners and engineers. We don't focus on the people aspect. With engineering, we say, again, this is how you do the cut and fill, and this is how you determine the curve. But no one says, oh, and by the way, there's a cemetery right there, so you might want to design the curve to go around the cemetery. Or there's operational things happening with freight, with buses. So I think overall, educationally, that is something that can be better. I think also for both professions, we need more diversity, and not just there's gender diversity, there's racial diversity, there is diversity of where people come from. Because I will say, even for me, having lived mostly on the East Coast, going to Texas, I have a different view and a different appreciation, and I'm not as dogmatic about certain things given the context of being in a Texas city. And so being involved in the National Association of City Transportation Officials and the update of the bike guide, it's bringing that thinking of, yes, there's a lot of DCs. New York is always going to be literally on an island of its own. But many cities, particularly in the Midwest and the South, are more like Texas than they are like these cities. And these are just things that we have to consider. And so you need that diversity of people that can say, I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and, everyone has this, or I grew up here. And, from my perspective in Texas, having lived in Houston, everyone has a big truck, and not even just like the Ford F-150. There's a Texas edition, which is even bigger than a traditional Ford F-150. So my design vehicle isn't a sedan like most cities. I got to design for these big old trucks to maneuver. And so I think that is what's needed in the profession, to just have that overall diversity of thought, bringing in people with disabilities, and not just the one wheelchair person and say, you're going to represent all the disabilities, but bring in people that have cognitive disabilities, people that have visual impairments, people that are hard of hearing. I know that in DC, they have Gallaudet University, which is a university that caters to people who are deaf and hard of hearing. And they have been focusing on what does design need to look like for someone that ASL is their primary means of American Sign Language is their primary means of communication. How does that design need to look? What does the lighting need to look like? How wide do the sidewalks need to be? So I think that, to me, at the root of all of it is we just need more diversity of thought within our industry.
And you are a thought leader in this space and transportation and within the industry. We know that the arc of change is long, but it doesn't always have to be. What are some of the traits that you think are most sort of important for leaders in this space today and for tomorrow?
I'm going to give you two, because there's a lot I could say. I would say there's two. So first and foremost is empathy. I think that all leaders need to have a level of empathy, and that is not just about patronizing other people, but truly being curious about people, being curious about where they're from, being curious about how they move, being curious about how they feel about why is this parking space so important to them, and just having that level of curiosity about different types of people, and not just when it's convenient where I'm trying to do this project, but truly immersing yourself in a culture that's not yours, decentering yourself. Secondly, I will say what leaders need to be, and this is not necessarily going to feel like a leadership quality, but they need to, as you grow in your career, make sure that you financially never need your job. And what I mean is, as you get a little bit more money, don't just go buy a bigger house, don't go buy a car, don't spend more. Truly save and have a pot of money, an emergency pot of money that you don't ever need that job. And I say it because being in these seats, being in leadership seats require a lot of boldness, a fearlessness, and the willingness to push to do the right thing. And if you need your job to pay your monthly bills, you can't be fearless. It doesn't matter who you are. Self-preservation is going to kick in when you need to feed your family, when you need to take care of your household. Self-preservation is always going to kick in, and you'll bend and you'll fold in order to just keep getting your paycheck every other week. But truly, to make the change that we need in these organizations, you need bold leaders that don't need this job. So those are the two leadership qualities: empathy and curiosity for others, and then financially being secure as you are growing in your career.
So you've talked a little bit about your work in Texas, in Houston specifically, where you were director of transportation and drainage operations. And Houston, a city with no zoning, which can seem otherworldly to us New Yorkers who have such a deep history with zoning. But I think one thing we clearly share is the relationship of how water shapes the city of New York as well as Houston. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about how a city's water systems and network impact your planning approach.
So first, I do want to make sure I explain. So the reason why my title is Transportation and Drainage Operations, I don't think that there's many people out there that have that title. But in the city of Houston, the roads are part of the drainage system. So when you see Roads flooded in a rain event. It's kind of like, all right, well, call me when the rain stops. If the water's still there, we'll come out. And that becomes challenging because what is working to help on the drainage side then makes impassable roads on the roadway side. I think the biggest thing that I took away from the whole experience is we have to really think about climate change, and not in a way that is intangible to people. Because I think sometimes we talk about sea level rise, or some people call land subsidence, but that feels far away. I think the tangible things are our storms are just getting more intense. It's not about the hurricanes, right? Like I think sometimes, especially being in Texas, hurricanes can be in the front of mind of people. It's not really the hurricanes as much as it is just, it's Monday and it's raining and it's these intense rainstorms. As I look at New York City, so I grew up in New Jersey, when I look at New York City and you have these intense rains and it's like the subway's always flooding. And like maybe it happened growing up, but I don't remember the subways flooding at the level that they did when I was growing up. But also I don't remember rain being as intense as it was when I was growing up. And so I think that, that's what we have to plan for. The fact that even as I was leaving Texas, we got hit with the derecho, which I don't even know what a derecho is. It came out of nowhere. And just the amount of damage that this storm did, it was 100+ mile an hour winds for just 10 minutes. And the city is still trying to, recuperate and get back on track from that incident. And so as I think about water, we really have to think about water as kind of one water. And I know that's like the new buzz topic in the industry. But I know on the drinking water side, which was also in my department, but not under me, we had 2 droughts. And so they're like, we don't have any water. And I'm like, oh, I got plenty of water, And so I think we have to start thinking holistically about stormwater and drinking water, opportunities to reuse stormwater when we have these events. I think we have to think differently about resiliency and what does that look like? Because I think we're trying to fight this losing battle. I joked one time when I was standing in a road in Houston, I was like, can I give this road back to God? Because I can't win. We can spend millions and millions of dollars rebuilding this road, and it's still going to have the same challenges because we're in the floodplain. And I think that for many cities, we're going to have to start having these challenging conversations. We're going to have to start thinking about how we're building and how we are protecting different communities.
And as you work across cities, are you starting to see trends emerge in terms of being able to deal with some of these very complex challenges, as well as just opportunities for messaging the impacts of climate change to communities and to governments?
So I think that we're getting there, but we're not there yet across different cities. I think the conversation, it's kind of there, but I don't know that we have truly reckoned with what resiliency really means and what it really takes to get there. And as an example, it's, for a lot of cities right now, they're just trying to recover from whatever the last disaster was. You have North Carolina, they're going to be recovering for the next decades. I mean, think about New York City. You're still recovering from Sandy. Mm-hmm. And in Houston, we're still recovering from Harvey. And so it's so hard to even look at the future when you're just like, we're just trying to get back to what we were. And so I don't know that we're there. And I think that it's also hard to look to the future when the now is in your face, when today I already don't have enough money. Mm-hmm. I don't have enough people. The boomers are leaving the workforce in droves. You're starting to have the older Gen Xers beginning to leave the workforce. And now you want me to think about 50. I can't pick a battle, pick your struggle. Right. And so right now my struggle is I'm just trying to get everybody back to where they were. And so I think that there's the desires there, but I don't know that we're really doing what we need to do in this country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Emily touched on sort of the layers of sort of the resilience of infrastructure and sort of the equity components about all of that, thinking about the sense of urgency, the cost to be able to like deliver that level of service for, communities. Can you talk a little bit about that from your perspective, having worked in Houston and elsewhere? But there's so much to sort of like unpack and sort of think about how we prioritize infrastructure for communities.
Particularly as we think about Black, brown, low-income communities, I don't really care what city in this country you are, the problems are the same. It is where you're going to have your high injury network, which means people are dying or being seriously injured. It is where you're going to have your high asthma rates. It's where you're going to have your high obesity. It is where you're likely going to have some other environmental things in the air, whether it's chemicals, whether it's, what other, brownfields, it's compounding issues. And so equity says, okay, how do I really be able to serve this community? And then there's the grappling part of there's so many challenges. How do you begin to tackle it, right? And as an example, we had a community in Houston where there's a cancer cluster. They're sitting on top of a creosote plume. It's also the 100-year floodplain. And we were grappling with that. And so there was a voluntary buyout program that is being stood up to not say you're not forced to go, but even then there's challenges because people want to stay in their community. So I think it's hard. But also I had the benefit of, we had these things called complete communities. And that is where each community, there was 10 of them, they wrote their own action plans. And our directive by the mayor at the time was give the people what they've asked for. And we did. And we brought in well over $200 million of bipartisan infrastructure law money, which will go to these communities. All the money that Houston brought in is going to Black, brown, low-income communities. And it came from being able to make the decision, being willing to make the decision, even when you have council members that are saying, what about my community? And you're like, I hear you. It's not unsafe. It could be safer, but this is the priority, but let me work with you to address your issue.
I love how you're talking about both merging the bottom up and the top down. And so curious, that kind of effective middle and translating both perspectives, both views. If you just have some good tips for people to really be making those really critical connections, because no matter what you're dealing with in planning or transportation, it's big. Mm-hmm. And big is hard. And so we need those translators to be connecting the different views of the scales.
Yeah. One of the things I have learned, we have to just talk in the community's language. I think so often we have things that we use and we'll say mobility and we'll say equity and we'll say accessibility. To a layperson, it doesn't mean anything. And then when you have different professions, mobility in our world and mobility in the medical world is very different. Mobility in the economic world is very different. And so we're not even speaking the same language. And I think it's incumbent upon us to just start where the community is. They may not say the right term, but we can't pretend we don't understand what they're saying. We just have to ask questions. Okay, tell me more. What is this thing that you're talking about? Okay, tell me a little bit more. Oh, okay, I got you. I understand what you're saying to me. And so I think that I was joking the other day, it's really, we need to talk at a level of a 10-year-old can understand. And if a 10-year-old can't understand what we're saying, then the community at large doesn't understand what we're saying. And as an example, we'll say things like cyclist. What about people on bikes? That's something that's a very clear image of what we're talking about. As we talk about, mobility, what does that even mean? Well, it is about people having options to be able to just get to work, to play, to social. So I think that's really what's important about the translation. Forget about even other languages, like even for people that English is their only language, they don't understand what we're saying. And I think we as a professionals have to be more cognizant of that and making sure that we are speaking, taking the time to do additional explanations in a way that they can understand.
So your career has sort of transitioned from the federal government, working for cities, working for the private sector. Can you shed some light on one of your most sort of transformative projects that you've had an opportunity to work on?
Oh my gosh. Most transformative projects. I'll say this one. One of my most transformative projects, it was working in the city of Houston. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we had these complete communities, and the Gulfton neighborhood is, we call it Little Ellis Island. No offense to the New Yorkers, but largely it's because you have a lot of immigrants that are coming into Houston, and they settle in this community because, like all immigrants, you tend to settle where there's people from your country that understand your language, your religion, your culture. And so in this one particular community, it's a lot of immigrants who aren't driving, who are dependent on bus, walking, and biking. And we took this road, and when you look at the picture of this road, it is like an 8-lane road with a median. And of course, it's dangerous. And people were getting struck and killed or seriously injured. And so we took away a few lanes of traffic, added in a concrete protected bike lane. I mentioned it's Texas. So a concrete protected bike lane. And then eventually added in asphalt art at the intersection where the community worked with artists in order to do something that displayed what they wanted. And since then, there have been no fatalities or serious injuries. There have been crashes. But a crash is a bad day. At the end of the day, it really is about making sure people are walking away from the crash and aren't requiring additional medical attention. And so we were able to achieve that. And then in addition, being able to get some reconnecting communities planning money in order to extend the project to the other side of the highway in order to connect this community to a transit center, which would give them access to more buses to move throughout the city. So that's one of the really, to me, transformative projects that I had a chance to work on.
Great. So you talked a lot about great conversations with communities and really being empathetic and positioning yourself and your planning work to understand communities where you're working. Could you talk a little bit about reaching communities to begin with? Different communities with different needs. There's also a physical piece of that communication. And could you talk a little bit about successes and what you think we need to do about creating space for these important conversations?
Yeah. One of the challenges of public engagement is we love to have public meetings in the evening, right during dinner time, in a stale elementary school with the dead roach in the corner, right? And we're like, only 50 people came to the meeting, right? And we already know who's going to come. Before we even showed up, I don't care where you work, who's going to be there and what their issues are. And that's because generally, it's the people passionately for or passionately against the project, and they're going to show up. And there's this whole group in the middle that are just trying to survive. They're just trying to get through the next day and get through the work shift, pick up their child from childcare, feed their family, and keep it moving. And so it really is about meaningful public engagement and ensuring that you're reaching at least a representative population of the community. And what that looks like is going to where they are. I'm the author of Inclusive Transportation, a manifesto for repairing divided communities. And one of the projects I talk about is a bus project. And what we did was we looked at the data to see when were people getting on and off the bus. We knew quickly we weren't doing any engagement at the morning because everyone's just focused on getting on the bus and getting to work. But what we did was we focused on the evening, and we focused on different shifts to get shift workers who weren't moving at traditional peak hours. And we literally just set up the meeting in the bus. And so people stepped off the bus and they were in the meeting and they were like, okay, I guess I'm here. And then we designed, to have very focused questions, because when you're getting someone off the street, you have about 5 minutes of their attention. So what information do you want to give them in that 5 minutes? What information do you want to get from them in that 5 minutes? And I have a lot of data to show that when we did this, we were able to almost perfectly, from a demographic perspective, match the community. Did we talk to everyone? No, but demographically, we were able to match, English speakers, non-English speakers, gender, age, and income. So it's about that intentionality and the quest to be meaningful in your engagement.
Hey, listeners, we hope you're enjoying this episode of our podcast. For those of you who are as enthusiastic about transportation and planning as we are, we'd like to hear from you. You can submit topics and questions that you'd like us to cover at nyc.gov/curb enthusiasm. And now, back to our conversation. So transportation and land use policies are really inextricably linked, especially when it comes to climate change. Could you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of project prioritization funding that's coming down the line as we are taking a stronger step towards addressing the climate crisis?
I actually just recently finished a book, Paved Paradise. And so I think where those two really intersect is around the parking side of it. And parking is probably the third, fourth, and fifth rail of politics. Nobody wants to lose their parking. I know New York is definitely featured in that book for if your listeners haven't had a chance to read it. But I think that's where we can have an impact. And that's where the transportation profession can begin to start moving the needle. And that is things like removing some of the parking minimums and doing away with parking where we know we don't need it, when we're trying to get housing on top of transit stations or in transit-rich areas. But if we can just remove that parking element, it gives us the ability to build more houses and more affordably because we don't have to build the parking. And so I think that is kind of where we're slowly getting there. And I think as the housing crisis is really continuing to confront us, we're slowly addressing it. I will say a opportunity as we come out of the pandemic of COVID and transition into the endemic of our downtowns. I know New York is a little bit different of again, you guys are always in your own conversation bubble, but I think for a lot of other cities, they're grappling with their downtowns. People don't want to go back to work. And so all these articles shaming people about not being in the office, and they're like, that's cool, I'm still not going back to work. And you have vacant buildings and some cities are looking at, okay, well, how do we start transitioning some of these offices to residential? We know we need housing for people. And I think you'll start to see more of that just because the employment market has been very clear. We're not going back to the office. And if you make us go back to the office, we're just going to change jobs. And guess what? You need every employee right now. So I do think that in a couple of years, we'll start to see more housing in downtown areas, and hopefully it begins to start easing some of that housing burden. And then from a transportation perspective, we should start to see then transit ridership go back up into the downtowns. Transit ridership is up in some of those ancillary routes, but I think we'll start to see that increase again in the downtown routes.
An exciting pivot that we saw in New York over the course of the pandemic was a lot of demand for public space and other types of transformative street projects that we had typically focused in downtown areas, commercial districts, where there were already a lot of people. Through open streets, we saw demand for these types of treatments in residential neighborhoods. And so that's been a really interesting shift to bring and translate a lot of these types of street transformations to neighborhoods where they're equally as important. They're about, getting kids to school safely or people being able to walk to a park or the grocery store, for example. So that's also an interesting trend that we are seeing in New York.
Absolutely. And economically, it makes sense. I mean, storing an unused vehicle is very expensive, and we have ceded our curbsides to vehicle storage. And we all know that having restaurant and that same parking space is going to generate more economics, right? The sales tax revenue, the jobs that are being created, because now there's more servers that have to serve these areas. We know that overall that is better. And so I hope that I love the trend. I hope it continues. And I hope that people are truly documenting the impact of that trend so that we can say, all right, you could have this parking space that someone may pay $35 a year for a permit to park their car there. Or this parking space can generate, XXX dollars of revenue each day as a restaurant, as an extended bookstore, or just as people are going to other restaurants and then just sitting there and recreating with their child. I think that we have to start telling that story more and helping people understand the trade-offs of, is that parking that important to you? Or is this experience that you could have more important?
Absolutely. It's not just about taking something away, but it's about getting so much more out of the space.
Mm-hmm.
So we've seen within the current administration with the bipartisan infrastructure law, a real focus on sort of the Justice 40 initiatives, which really brings in sort of conversations around urban development and transportation and really trying to prioritize where some of these investments are being made. Can you speak to sort of the significance of being able to bring in sort of the urban development piece to the transportation conversation? Because I think that oftentimes is missing, and there are some missed opportunities for that have implications for like mobility and transportation systems within cities.
I will say that the bipartisan infrastructure law, and so at the time that it was passed, I was the vice president of the National Association of City Transportation Officials. And we were definitely at the forefront of making sure cities got direct funding. One of the projects that the city of Houston received, it was a Safe Streets for All grant. It was the most dangerous road that the city owned, where people were being killed and seriously injured. It also is an area where there is a lot of sex trafficking and sex work. And it is using this transportation money to be able to start multi-solving many problems. And so being able to work with the Houston Police Department to begin to solve these challenges in a way that is humane, in a way that is respectful, and in a way that improves the overall corridor. So I think that's one of the exciting things of everything that is happening. And what I'm really excited to see, I also serve on the U.S. Department of Transportation's Advisory Committee on Transportation Equity. And some of the recommendations that we provided to U.S. DOT was, with this bipartisan infrastructure law money, is make sure that we are evaluating our effectiveness, and not just once the project is complete, but let's be intentional to come back in 2 years and 5 years, so that, did we make this road safer? Did we encourage economic development? Most importantly, is the community still here to be able to enjoy this project that we put in their community? And I think those things are extremely important.
What are some evaluation metrics that you're seeing other cities develop that start to speak to the co-benefits of these types of projects that go beyond just the safety, the economic benefits? Like, what are some great examples of drawing out more of the valuable layers of this type of work?
One of the things I share in my book is Interstate I-10 through East Baton Rouge took property from my family. So my mother was in high school at the time when she was displaced in order to build I-10. And so there's people alive today who remember what that looks like. And so I think that is the type of metrics that I'm interested in seeing, of not just economically did we improve, which is important, not just the reconnection, but the fact that we are doing reparations to families, to businesses that are no longer here because they were asked to leave so that we could build this infrastructure. And so that's what I think is an exciting metric, if you will, or a tactic. So I'm really interested to see how that is able to pan out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we also often see that when there are disasters, oftentimes the money can go to the people who are coming in and new and rebuilding, versus really focusing on who was there, who was impacted, who struggled the most to try to stay and keep things afloat. And so also thinking about how we can recognize supporting the legacy community as much as supporting kind of new continued growth to allow these communities to thrive in the future.
And because you've made the improvements, the unfortunate part is you've now have made it more attractive. And so you really then have that next challenge. And if some people like to call it gentrification, I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. But I think that's also part of it, and that balance and that fear sometimes that communities have of, well, why are you coming to me now? Mm-hmm. So I've been here. Where have you been? Why are you here now? Oh, then you must not be doing this for me. Because if you were doing this for me, you'd have done this decades ago. And so I think that there's that other, sensitivity that we have to have as practitioners when we work with communities of there is a lack of trust because the last time we were there, we destroyed their community. And now we're coming back to we're the government and we're here to fix it. And it's like, okay, but why are you fixing it now? Who's coming in? And that's where, bike lanes in particular, kind of get wrapped up in, oh, it's for the white people. And so I think we have to just overall do a better job of communication and having that cultural sensitivity every time we work with communities.
Yeah, we're going to switch to a little lighthearted tone. You mentioned sort of your journey to get here for this podcast and taking the subway. So I'm curious, what is your biggest breach of subway etiquette?
Oh my gosh. It is when a man sits down on that subway and spreads across like 3 seats, like, sir, please close your legs. That is my biggest thing. Like, get your knee off of me. Do not touch me. That is the biggest breach of subway etiquette. Number 2 would be not standing to the right on an escalator, but number 1 is the bigger one.
Yeah, that is debatable too, and depending on like which part of the city or like countries that may like drive on the different sides of the road, I do see that there are some differences overall.
I also feel like people got a little comfortable with the extra space on the subway when ridership was low over the pandemic. So I also see plenty of people with like, a bag sitting next to them and just kind of spreading out a little bit, a little too relaxed for, full train cars and lots of different people with different needs. Right. So also wanted to ask you something we ask all of our guests. What are you most enthusiastic about the future of transportation?
Ooh, what am I most enthusiastic about? I'll say this. I think the thing that has been the most exciting about the bipartisan infrastructure law is the investment in high-speed rail. And I think that becomes exciting. As mentioned, I took Amtrak to get here today from Maryland, and it was a great trip. But imagine that trip being half the time and what it could do. And so I think that investment is really, really exciting. And I hope that these projects are able to move forward. I think that's the thing I'm most excited about, just being able to connect different cities, being able to move faster between cities, particularly, the Northeast corridor, as we all know, it is the most traveled corridor. And so imagine, New York to DC. I don't know what the time is. Like, was it at 90 minutes is what they're saying?
On Acela?
No, on the actual high-speed rail.
Oh.
Yeah, what is it supposed to be? I don't remember.
I'm not entirely sure.
But it's supposed to be like slower. Half the time, like 90 minutes. Sure. Could you imagine? That opens up even from a work perspective, the ability to, live in New York and work in Philadelphia or, live in Philadelphia and work in DC. So I think that's what I'm most excited about.
Great. Well, Veronica, thank you so much for being here today. And I can say, I think we're certainly excited to see what you do with your extra hour and a half once high-speed rail is implemented. So excited for what you are able to achieve with all that extra time.
Thank you all for having me.
Thank you.